In 1953, Mack Trucks built a machine so tough that the English language had to make room for it. Built like a Mack truck became something people just said, not because of a marketing campaign, because the B-61 earned it, one load at a time, on roads that barely existed, driven by men who sometimes didn't sleep for days. The story of the B-61 isn't just about a truck. It's about what America asked its drivers to do, what it cost them, and the machine that refused to break even when the men behind the wheel were breaking apart. So, 1945. The war is over. 35,000 Mack trucks had served in the Allied effort, hauling artillery, moving troops, building airfields from North Africa to Normandy. Mack had also built over 2,600 powertrains for tanks and assembled components for B-24 Liberator bombers at their Allentown bus plant. The company knew how to build things that survived punishment. That was never the question. The question was what came next. Mack itself had been around since 1893, when Jack and Augustus Mack bought a wagon company in Brooklyn. Jack was 14 when he'd run away from home in Pennsylvania to work as a teamster. By his 20s, he was building engines. Their first motorized vehicle was a 20-passenger sightseeing bus in 1900, powered by a 36-horsepower engine Jack designed himself. By World War I, the Mack AC model, with its blunt, squared-off hood and chain-driven rear axle, had earned the nickname Bulldog from British soldiers who couldn't break it no matter how hard they tried. Over 6,000 ACs served in the war. Some of them, built on solid rubber tires in the 1920s, were still spotted working on American streets in the 1950s. That's how long a Mack lasted. Decades past any reasonable expectation. America was changing fast after the Second War. The economy wasn't just recovering, it was detonating. Factories that had been stamping out tank parts were now building refrigerators and televisions. Suburbs were spreading out from every major city, and all of that stuff, every appliance, every bag of cement, every steel beam, had to get from where it was made to where it was needed. Trains couldn't do it alone anymore. The country needed trucks. A lot of them. And it needed them to go places trains couldn't reach. But here's the thing, the roads weren't ready. President Eisenhower had signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, authorizing the interstate highway system. Eisenhower knew roads mattered. He'd been part of a military convoy in 1919 that used Mack AC trucks to cross the country on the Lincoln Highway. That trip took 62 days. Bridges collapsed under the weight. Trucks got stuck in mud for hours. The experience stuck with him. Decades later, as president, he pushed through the largest highway construction program in history. But in practice, the interstate meant decades of construction, and during those decades, trucks were already running on two-lane state highways, on gravel, on mud, through mountain passes with no guardrails and switchbacks that would make a goat nervous. The interstate system wouldn't be substantially complete until the 1980s. The freight couldn't wait that long. The old Mack L series had been a solid truck, tough, reliable, a little ugly. But it was a 1940s design trying to work in a 1950s world. Mack needed something new, not revolutionary, just better at everything. A truck that could haul 60,000 pounds of steel on a highway and then turn around and drag construction equipment through a swamp. The B-Series was supposed to be that truck, and the B-61, the heavy-duty tractor variant, became the one everybody remembers. Mack's engineers had spent the late 1940s working on the design. They didn't start from scratch. They started from what they knew, which was that trucks get beaten to death, and the ones that survive are the ones people buy again. The B-Series kept the conventional cab layout, driver sitting behind a long hood, engine out front. But the styling was different. The old boxy fenders were replaced with rounded ones. The headlights were integrated into the bodywork instead of bolted on top like afterthoughts. The windshield had a slight slope to it. For a truck, It looked almost elegant. Almost. But the real story wasn't the sheet metal. It was what sat underneath. The problem Mack faced was one that every truck manufacturer in America was wrestling with in the early 50s. Diesel engines were clearly the future. They were more efficient than gasoline engines, more durable, better suited for heavy loads over long distances. But American diesel technology in 1950 was, to put it politely, behind the curve. The engines were slow, narrow in their power bands, and the fuel injection systems were crude. Mack had been building its own diesels since 1938, using a pre-combustion design called the Lenova system. It worked, barely. The Lenova engines were reliable enough, but they were loud. They rattled like a box of wrenches thrown down a staircase, and they topped out at around 1,800 revolutions per minute. That was fine for dump trucks crawling around construction sites. It was not fine for a highway tractor trying to maintain 50 miles per hour with 40,000 pounds of freight behind it. The solution came from an unlikely place: Sweden. Mack had a licensing relationship with Scania, a Swedish truck and engine manufacturer. Mack had sold Scania the rights to build Mack transit buses in Scandinavia. In return, Mack got a close look at what Scania was doing with direct-injection diesel technology, and what Scania was doing was years ahead of anything in America. Direct injection meant the fuel went straight into the combustion chamber instead of bouncing through a pre-chamber first. Cleaner burn, more power, higher RPM capability. Mack's engineers took Scania's combustion chamber design and married it to their own engine block. The result was the End 673. They called it the Thermodyne, 673 cubic inches, an inline six-cylinder diesel. In its naturally aspirated form, it made around 170 horsepower. Later, turbocharged versions pushed past 220. Those numbers sound modest today. They were not modest in 1953. And the way the engine made its power mattered more than the peak number. The Thermodyne had torque, 500 foot-pounds of it at 1,400 RPM. It was designed to lug, to grab hold of a load and pull, steady and relentless, mile after mile, without complaint. It didn't scream, it growled. And if you've ever heard one winding up through the gears, you know exactly what that sounds like. Nothing on earth that burns diesel sounds quite like a B-model Mack. 80% of all Mack trucks built between 1953 and 1966 ran a Thermodyne variant. That's not a popular engine option. That's a dynasty. But the engine had a weakness. The power band was narrow. The gap between peak torque and peak horsepower was tight, which meant the driver had to shift constantly to keep the engine in its sweet spot. Mack's answer to this was transmissions, lots of transmissions, and lots of gears. The B-61 came with a two-stick setup, two gear levers side by side poking up out of the cab floor. The main box was a 5-speed. Bolted to the back of it was a compound auxiliary section. Depending on the configuration, you got a duplex with 10 speeds, a triplex with 15, or the legendary quadruplex with 20. 20 forward gears, operated by two sticks, with no power steering, in a cab that had all the sound insulation of a tin shed. Driving a B-61 was a skill, not a casual one. Compound shifts, where you moved both levers simultaneously, were required when one gearbox ran out of ratios. Experienced drivers would bend the shift levers closer together so they could palm both knobs with one hand. The other hand was on the steering wheel. The steering wheel, by the way, was enormous, a massive 3-spoke affair the size of a dinner table. You needed it to be that big because turning the front wheels at low speed, loaded with no hydraulic assist, required actual physical strength. Drivers hooked their elbows through the wheel to hold course while shifting. That's not a technique they taught you. That's a technique you invented because you had no other choice. Now. Here's where the story gets darker. The B-61 arrived at exactly the right moment. America's post-war economic boom was creating freight demand that the trucking industry had never seen. By 1964, 8 million Americans were making their living from trucking. 18 million commercial trucks were on the road. And for the first time in history, motor carrier revenue surpassed railroad freight revenue. That happened in 1963. The trucks had won. But winning came at a cost, and the men who paid that cost were the drivers. The 1950s and 60s were the Wild West of American trucking. Hours of service regulations existed on paper. In practice, they were widely ignored. Drivers were expected to run, to keep running. Loads had deadlines. Dispatchers had pressure. And the entire economic model of long-haul trucking was built on one simple, brutal premise: the faster you deliver, the more you earn. So drivers drove 12 hours, 16 hours, 20 hours, sometimes more. In the early days, there were no tachographs. Paper logbooks were the only record of hours, and they were so routinely falsified that drivers had a nickname for them: comic books. You kept 2 or 3, one for the company, one for the highway patrol, one that told the truth if you even bothered. The cab of a B-61 was not designed for marathon sessions. It was loud, ear-damaging loud. The Thermodyne diesel, for all its virtues, transmitted every combustion event directly through the frame and into the driver's spine. There was no sound insulation to speak of. That was normal for the era, but normal didn't make it safe. Drivers developed hearing loss over years of exposure. They accepted it the way coal miners accepted black lung. Part of the job. The Camelback suspension, Mack's famous tandem rear setup with its inverted leaf springs riding over a central trunnion, was nearly indestructible. It was also, by universal agreement, brutal on the human body. The old-timers had a saying about it: "Ride like a Mack." It wasn't a compliment. Loaded, the ride was tolerable. Empty, it would rattle your teeth loose. The rubber shock pads they called elephant feet transferred impacts straight through the chassis. After enough miles, you felt it in your lower back first. Then your kidneys. Then everywhere. Drivers who spent years in B-model Macks developed back problems that followed them for the rest of their lives. One trucker forum regular put it simply: he was still wearing a back brace 40 years later. Nobody filed workers' compensation for that. It was just what driving a truck did to you. And then there were the pills. Amphetamines had been part of American trucking culture since the late 1940s. Benzodrine sulfate, bennies, co-pilots, pep pills. Drivers called them different things in different regions, but the effect was the same. Stay awake, keep driving, meet the deadline. By the mid-1950s, the amphetamine problem in trucking had become so severe that the FDA organized an undercover investigation. They actually trained food and drug inspectors to work as truck drivers. These agents drove rigs, slept in truck stops, and bought pills from the same sources the real drivers used: drugstores, gas stations, other drivers. One investigator bought 2,000 pills from a single pharmacy without being questioned. The results were ugly. Drivers on extended amphetamine binges were hallucinating behind the wheel of loaded trucks. One driver was found after a crash, still delusional, claiming his friend Benny had been driving. There was no one else in the cab. 18-wheelers were swerving off highways, plowing into oncoming traffic, or simply drifting off the road when the driver finally lost consciousness. The pills kept you awake. For a while. Then they stopped working. And when they stopped all at once. The crash, the real crash, the biological one, hit like a wall. Drivers went from alert to unconscious with almost no warning. Even when the half-empty bottles of pills were found in the wreckage, it was nearly impossible to prove cause and effect in court. Trucking companies posted signs in their terminals: "Get your rest, bennies can kill." But the companies also set the delivery schedules. The deadlines didn't change. The signs were for liability, not for safety. Dave Dudley's 1963 hit 6 Days on the Road painted a picture of the long-haul trucker that was part romance, part reality. 6 days on the road. Think about that. The song was a chart topper. The lifestyle it described was grinding men to dust. The connection to the B-61 isn't that Mack built a truck that encouraged this. They didn't. The connection is that the B-61 was the truck most of these men were driving. It was the dominant heavy-duty tractor of its era. If a loaded rig was running coast to coast in the late 50s or early 60s, odds were good it had a gold bulldog on the hood and a Thermodyne under that long, sloped hood. The truck was reliable enough to go forever. The men driving it were not. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. So let's talk about what made this truck so hard to kill. Because that's the engineering story that turned the B-61 from a successful product into a legend. Start with the frame. Mack used heavy-gauge steel rails, heat-treated and riveted. Not welded, riveted. The same construction method used on bridges and ships. A riveted frame can flex without cracking. It absorbs stress across the joint instead of concentrating it at a weld point. This made the B-61's chassis remarkably tolerant of abuse, overloading, rough terrain, years of constant vibration. The frame just absorbed it. The Thermodyne engine itself was built like the truck it powered. Wet cylinder sleeves, meaning the sleeves were in direct contact with the coolant jacket. This was a Scania influence, and it served two purposes: better cooling under sustained heavy loads and easier rebuilding. When the cylinder bore wore out, you pulled the sleeve and dropped in a new one. You didn't have to rebore the block. This meant a Thermodyne could be rebuilt multiple times over its life. Engines with 500,000 miles were common. Some went past 1 million. The fuel injection system was a Bosch mechanical unit, precise, durable, and relatively simple to service in the field. No electronics, no sensors. A competent mechanic with the right tools could diagnose and fix most injection problems on the side of the road. That mattered in 1958 when your truck broke down on a 2-lane highway in Montana and the nearest dealer was 200 miles away. The Thermodyne's direct injection combustion chamber design, borrowed from Scania, used a toroidal cavity machined into the piston crown. Fuel was injected directly into this cavity at high pressure. The shape of the chamber promoted a swirling air motion that mixed the fuel thoroughly, resulting in a more complete burn than the old Lenova system. Better fuel efficiency, less unburned diesel in the exhaust, more usable power per gallon. Mack called the engine Thermodyne, combining thermo for heat and dyne, from the Greek dynamis, meaning power. Marketing speak, sure, but it was accurate marketing speak. The transmission deserves its own discussion. Those 2-stick gearboxes were entirely Mack designed and Mack built. Constant mesh gear sets, no synchromesh. Every shift required matching engine speed to gear speed, which meant double clutching on upshifts and downshifts. Miss the timing and you ground gears. Miss it badly, and you could damage the constant mesh dogs or, in the worst case, blow the auxiliary case apart. The Unishift, a single-stick 10-speed with an air-operated splitter, was supposed to simplify things. It did. Until the air system failed or the linkage got hung between gears. Then it simplified things by destroying the transmission. Most experienced B-61 drivers preferred the 2-stick setup. More effort, more skill required, but more control and more reliability. A 2-stick triplex transmission, properly maintained, would outlast the truck it was bolted to. Then there was the Camelback. Mack introduced this tandem rear suspension in 1948, and it was still in production decades later. The design was distinctive. A set of heavy inverted leaf springs arched over a central trunnion mounted between the two rear axles. As one axle went up over a bump, the spring pack rocked on the trunnion and pushed the other axle down. This kept both drive axles in contact with the ground, distributing load evenly and providing traction that competitors struggled to match. On construction sites, in mud, on loose gravel, the Camelback was nearly unbeatable. Mack paired the Camelback with their own top-mounted carrier axles. The differential housing sat on top of the axle tube instead of hanging below it. This gave the B-61 more ground clearance under the axle, which mattered when you were crawling over rough terrain. It also meant the drive shaft angles were reduced, which improved efficiency and reduced wear on the universal joints. And then there was the Bulldog. Every B-61 that rolled off the line in Allentown, Pennsylvania, with a full Mack powertrain, Mack engine, Mack transmission, Mack axles, got a gold-plated Bulldog hood ornament. If any component in the drivetrain came from another manufacturer, the Bulldog was chrome. Drivers knew what the gold meant. It meant everything under the hood, and behind it was Mack. Built in-house, no outsourcing. Mack was one of the only manufacturers in the world that could make that claim. Engine, transmission, axles, suspension, all Mack, all designed to work together as a system. Alfred Massery, Mack's chief engineer, had carved the original Bulldog ornament out of a bar of soap in 1932 while recovering from surgery. He patented the design. It started as a functional handle for unscrewing the radiator cap. Later, when exposed radiators moved behind grills, the Bulldog became a hood latch handle. It was decorative, it was functional, and it became the most recognizable emblem in trucking. The B-61 was never the fastest truck on the road, with a top speed somewhere around 60 miles per hour, depending on gearing and load. It was designed for pulling, not sprinting. And it wasn't the most comfortable. We've covered that. What it was the truck you could buy in 1953, work mercilessly for a decade, rebuild once, and work for another decade, and another after that. B-model Macks, built in the 50s, were still hauling loads in the 1990s. Some were held together with bungee cords and duct tape by that point. They were still running. Mack built over 126,000 B-Series trucks between 1953 and 1966. Of those, 47,459 were B-61s. That's more than any other B-Series variant by a wide margin. The B-61 wasn't just Mack's bestseller. It was the truck that defined what a heavy-duty American tractor was supposed to be. The consequences of the B-61 rippled through the industry in ways that went far beyond sales numbers. It changed what fleets expected from a truck. Before the B-Series, many operators accepted that trucks were disposable. You ran them hard for a few years, then you scrapped them and bought new ones. The B-61's durability changed that calculation. Suddenly, a truck was an asset that could last decades with proper maintenance. That shifted the economics of the entire industry. Fleet operators started thinking in terms of life cycle cost, not just purchase price. And Mack's reputation for building trucks that lasted became its most powerful sales tool. The Thermodyne engine's success validated the direct-injection diesel approach in America. Before the B-Series, most American truck diesels used some form of indirect injection. After the Thermodyne proved its worth in hundreds of thousands of trucks across millions of miles, the industry followed. Direct injection became the standard. It still is. The relationship with Scania, born from that initial technology exchange, grew into something much larger. By the early 1960s, Mack and Scania were jointly developing a V8 diesel, the End 864, which debuted in 1962 at Mack's new engine plant in Hagerstown, Maryland. That partnership would continue for decades and eventually lead, indirectly, to the corporate entanglements that saw Mack acquired by the Volvo Group in 2000. But the B-61 also exposed the dark side of the American trucking boom. The industry's explosive growth had been built on the backs of drivers who were underpaid, overworked, and operating in conditions that no modern safety standard would tolerate. The truck could run all day. The man couldn't. And the gap between what the machine could endure and what the human body could survive created a crisis that took decades to address. Hours of service rules were tightened. Drug testing was eventually mandated. Cab designs improved to reduce noise and vibration. Electronic logging devices replaced paper logbooks that drivers could easily falsify. All of that came later. In the 50s and 60s, the B-61 just kept pulling, and the men who drove it just kept driving. Because the loads didn't stop. Because the bills didn't stop. Because America was building itself into a superpower, and the freight had to move. And because in that era, trucking culture treated endurance as a virtue. The guy who could run the longest, sleep the least, and still back a 40-foot trailer into a tight dock was the guy everyone respected. The culture rewarded exactly the behavior that was destroying the drivers. Mack's own financial story during this period had its own dark chapter. Despite the B-Series being a massive commercial success, the company was struggling internally. Finance-oriented executives with no experience in truck manufacturing had taken control. They deferred maintenance on the factories. They let facilities deteriorate. They moved the corporate offices from Allentown to Montvale, New Jersey, effectively isolating management from the workers on the shop floor. From 1959 to 1964, Mack's earnings dropped from $15.8 million to $3.4 million. A proposed merger with Chrysler was blocked by the Justice Department. By 1965, the company was in serious trouble. Zenon Hansen, a career trucking executive, took over as president that year. People told him he was boarding a sinking ship. He turned it around. But the fact that Mack nearly went under while producing one of the most successful trucks in American history tells you something about how little the quality of the product mattered when the money people were making bad decisions at the top. The phrase, "built like a Mack truck," entered the American vocabulary during the era of the AC model in World War I. But it was the B-61 that gave it its deepest meaning, not just strong, not just tough, relentless. A machine that would keep going past the point where anything reasonable would have stopped, including, sometimes, the person operating it. Today, surviving B-61s are scattered across the country. Some are in museums. The Iowa 80 Trucking Museum has a beautifully restored 1963 model with the original 673 Thermodyne and a duplex 9-speed. The Mack Trucks Historical Museum in Allentown still stands on the ground where many of these trucks were assembled. Others sit in collectors' garages, polished and pampered. Showing up at American Truck Historical Society meets where old-timers gather around them and talk about the roads they used to run. A good restored B-61 can sell for $30,000 to over $100,000, depending on condition and originality. The Gold Bulldog models command a premium. A few here and there are still working, 50, 60 years old, held together by stubbornness and spare parts, still hauling something somewhere. That's not nostalgia. That's engineering. Mack replaced the B-Series with the R-Series in 1966. The R would go on to have a 40-year production run of its own, eventually starring in movies and becoming the face of trucker culture in the 1970s. But the R was built on what the B taught Mack, about durability, about vertical integration, about building a truck that was more than the sum of its parts. The B-61 was never glamorous, it was never fast, it was never comfortable. It was the truck that showed up, did the work, and came back for more, over and over, for decades. And if that's not the most American thing a machine can do, I don't know what is. The dark story of the B-61 isn't really about the truck at all. It's about what we asked of the people who drove it. The truck held up. It always held up. That was the point. That was also the problem. When the machine never quits, somebody has to decide when the driver should, and for a long time, nobody did. And there you have it. The Mack B-61, a truck that was too tough for its own good, driven by men who were tougher than they should have had to be. If you've ever ridden in one, or your old man drove one, or you've seen one rusting in a field somewhere, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.